Okay, great. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to the May meeting of Delaware Valley Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I'm Janice Rail. I am the president of the chapter, along with other things. And if you are interested in joining me in doing activism on church-state separation issues, we have some volunteer forms in the back. You can sign up for DVAU. This is our last meeting for the next several months. We will meet again in this room in September, and October we'll be in room 407, which is down the hall, and then back in room 405 in November. Over the summer, we're probably not going to have any meetings in Philadelphia unless I can find someone to host them, and we would need a different location. So we can only meet here 6 times a year. So tonight we have a very interesting presentation. Our speaker is Barbara Mancini. She is from Philadelphia, PA. She lives there with her husband and 2 teenage daughters, and she's been a nurse for over 2 decades. In 2013, Barbara was arrested and prosecuted in Pennsylvania on the charge of aiding the attempted suicide of her dying 93-year-old father after handing him his prescribed morphine 4 days before his death. A hospice nurse and police ignored his written advance directives, and he was hospitalized and treated in defiance of his end-of-life wishes. Barbara's prosecution lasted a year, during which time it garnered national attention, and it was roundly criticized throughout the media. Her case was dismissed when the Schuylkill County judge, the Honorable Jacqueline Russell, granted her petition for habeas corpus, concluding that a jury may not receive the case where it must rely on conjecture to reach a verdict, as the case presented to the court would not warrant submission to a jury due to lack of competent evidence elicited by the Commonwealth on the crime charged, with the Commonwealth's reliance on speculation and guess serving as an inappropriate means to prove its case. Defendant's position for habeas corpus is being granted. Barbara was interviewed about her case on TV's 60 Minutes and has become a vocal advocate for end-of-life choice. She will discuss how religion has influenced the laws in end-of-life cases and how it specifically became an issue in her case. And now may I present Barbara Mancini.
Thank you. I have a favorite quote by the writer James Baldwin, and explains nicely one of the reasons why I'm here tonight. James Baldwin said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." I'm going to tell you my story. All of us have had a beginning, a birth, and all of us will have an end. We are going to die someday. My message is to warn you and to inform you that dying can be perilous, not only for the person who is experiencing the dying, but also for a person's caregiver. Is there a tie-in here to the separation of church and state? Oh, yes. My hope is that we can inspire and work to have some compassionate changes in the law. In February 2013, I was arrested and prosecuted on the charge of aiding the attempted suicide of my dying 93-year-old father because I handed him his legally prescribed morphine at his request. Instead of my father having the peaceful and dignified death that he hoped for, he died after prolonged suffering and being subjected to exactly the medical treatment that he specified in his written advance directives that he never wanted. The circumstances and the politics that allowed this to happen could certainly happen again. My story is a cautionary tale. So here's a picture of my dad, Joe Yorshaw. He was one of 12 children born into a first-generation immigrant family. He was a decorated World War II veteran. And after the war, he worked hard to establish his own business. He was a contractor, and he did heavy excavation work. Married my mother, and together they raised 4 children. My dad had many talents, and among them was that he could build anything, and he could fix anything. My mom will say that she never had to call a repair person for any reason until the last year of my father's life. So I'm just going to brag a little bit here. What you see here is a deck that he rebuilt around a swimming pool. He did this by himself when he was 79 years old.
Wow.
This is a cement driveway that he poured by hand, by himself. It goes around the back of that house. He did this when he was 80 years old. Kind of gives you an idea of the type of person he was. He was fiercely independent, strong-willed, and had focused convictions about how he wanted to live. Does that describe anybody here tonight? Okay. He had a number of medical problems. He had diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, kidney disease, arthritis, and he'd had a stroke at one time, but he had recovered from that. But at the age of 92, he made the decision to stop taking the medicines that treated these conditions. Why? They weren't helping the quality of his life, which was getting worse over time. He talked about his feelings to his primary doctor and to my family, and with the full knowledge that this would likely shorten his life, we all agreed to respect his wishes. Now in February 2013, I was just a regular person. I've been married for 20 years. We have 2 older teens. I worked as an ER nurse. My husband and I do volunteer work in our community. My parents lived in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. It's in Schuylkill County. It's a rural county, about a 2-hour drive from my home here in Philadelphia. As my father's health worsened, I visited frequently, and I had always been calling several times a day, so I was very closely involved with my parents. By the age of 93, my dad was terminally ill. He enrolled in home hospice care, and I'm sure you're aware that hospice care is designed to provide comfort and relief of distressing symptoms for people in the last stages of life, people who are dying. So he enrolled in home hospice care, and he was having significant pain. As a nurse, I know that pain and other distressing symptoms often worsen as a person nears death. My father asked me to hand him his pain medicine. It was a partly filled 1-ounce vial of liquid morphine. The routine was that my father would open the childproof cap on the bottle, because my mother couldn't manage that, and she would then measure out the dose. So I did the same routine that day, but instead of him handing the bottle back to me, he just drank what was left in it before I could measure out the dose. I had no idea how many doses were left in that bottle. A home hospice nurse came later, and I told her what happened. At that point, my father was drowsy, but he was not unconscious. He was breathing normally, he was able to follow commands, and he was able to respond to questions. A hospice nurse and her supervisor insisted that my father be taken to the hospital to be treated for an overdose. Now, my father had written advance directives that explicitly stated he wanted no life-prolonging treatment. I was his legal healthcare proxy. He had a standing do not resuscitate order. He was adamant that he never wanted to go to a hospital. I tried in vain to assure that my father's wishes were respected. But the hospice called 911. Police and then paramedics arrived. and against my father's expressed wishes, he was taken to the hospital to be treated. Ironically, when the paramedics asked my father if he was having any pain, for the very first time, his answer was no. I was arrested then and there, right in the house. I was charged with aiding an attempted suicide. This is a second-degree felony in Pennsylvania, and conviction can result in up to 10 years in prison. The police captain who arrested me told me I no longer had any say in what happened to my father. In my presence, he spoke on the phone with the ER doctor, and he told the doctor that if my father died, things would go much worse for me. That information was relayed to my then 84-year-old mother, who was put in the agonizing position of having to choose between honoring her promise to my father, the man she loved and was married to for 62 years, choosing between that or helping her daughter. So, in order to help me, my mother gave consent for the hospital to treat my father. 2 hours after arriving in the ER, my father was given a medicine to reverse the effects of the morphine. He was livid that he'd been brought to the hospital, and he knew I was in trouble. He shouted and pleaded repeatedly, "Don't hurt Barbara. Don't let them hurt Barbara." My father suffered tremendously, not only from the treatment in the hospital, but from the anguish of knowing that I was being accused of helping him end his life. He died 4 days later from pneumonia, not from a morphine overdose. The Pennsylvania Attorney General then began a year-long, zealous prosecution of me. I was placed on unpaid leave from my job. The prosecutor had the court put a gag order on me, and I incurred over $100,000 in legal fees. The emotional and financial burden on my family and me was just enormous. Now, as Janice said, my case received widespread media coverage. It was local, national, even international. And the reaction? Shock and outrage. There were over 24 editorial and opinion pieces alone written about my case. And not one of the writers supported the decision to prosecute. Not one. It created a lot of sympathy for my father and me, but it also raised very legitimate concerns among the dying and their caregivers, who are now asking, can they do this to us too? Exactly 1 year after my father's death, a judge ruled that the case had no merit. The charge was dismissed, without any apology or recognition of the ordeal that they put us through from the hospice or the prosecutor. We were left to pick up the pieces of our lives. Here's the question that everybody had. How could this happen? Well, there were 4 elements that came together to create this horrific ordeal for my father and me. The first was failure of Hospice of Central Pennsylvania. My father was in home hospice care for 2 weeks with no medicine for pain. I called the hospice and I asked them to prescribe morphine, which is reasonable and appropriate. The vast majority of people in hospice care receive morphine for pain, about 90%. In fact, this same hospice had provided my father with morphine on a prior enrollment months earlier. Well, that phone call was later used as evidence against me. The prosecutor said that it showed I was intending to help my father end his life. I didn't know at the time that I made the phone call, but morphine had been prescribed for my father 2 weeks earlier, and the hospice withheld it. They later said that they did that because my father said he didn't want to take any medicines. Now, I will agree, he did not want to take any medicine if he thought it was going to prolong his life. But he was taking Tylenol and Motrin at home to treat his end-of-life pain. The hospice used this phrase repeatedly in their documentation about my father: comfortable despite pain. What the hell is that? I will tell you that my family and I vigorously dispute that characterization of how my father felt. In court, my attorney asked the hospice team leader, or you could call her the supervisor, if my father had the right to have as much medicine as he needed to control his pain. Her answer: that is not a stated right. This same supervisor also testified that my father should not receive any more than a very low dose of morphine, 2.5 milligrams, at any given time. This attitude guaranteed that my father would suffer until the very end. And it contradicts what the United States Supreme Court ruled in 1997 in 2 landmark cases. The majority opinion in both of these cases said that terminally ill patients have the right to have as much medicine as they need to relieve their pain, even if it advances the time of death. This is settled law. Incredible as it seems, either the hospice supervisor didn't know this, or she knew it and disagreed with the ruling. So how can you know if a given hospice provides good quality care? Unfortunately, you are on your own to figure that out. There is no public information available about the quality of hospice care. Now, the federal government does provide consumer data information about the quality of other healthcare companies, like hospitals, nursing homes, home health agencies. But there is no such data available about hospices, and it won't become available until 2017 at the earliest. So, someone's dying and their caregivers are left to choose a hospice the same way you might choose a home contractor. You have to get referrals from family and friends, because there's no public information available to physicians either about the quality of hospice care. There's another issue here too. By federal law, hospices are paid every day from the time a person enrolls until that person dies or is discharged out, regardless of whether that person receives services on a given day. In other words, they get paid every day, no matter what. So if a given hospice decides to cut back on some services, like nursing, they stand to make more money. That has led to the creation of 1,000 new hospices in the last decade. And virtually all of that growth has been in the for-profit sector. The second element of this ordeal was the law. The Pennsylvania statute that criminalizes aiding a suicide is vaguely written. And the problem with a vague law is that it is then left open to interpretation. The Pennsylvania Attorney General interpreted the law to mean that providing a dying man his legally prescribed medicine, which he was permitted by physician order to self-administer, rose to the felony level of aiding a suicide. Now here's where I quote Clarence Darrow, the famous trial attorney who had one of the most influential legal careers in American history, because I believe he said it best. He said, "I know that every step in the progress of humanity has been met and opposed by prosecutors." But let's look at the law. And I have a question for you. Is suicide illegal? Anybody want to answer that? The answer is no. A lot of people don't know that. It is not a crime in any of the 50 states for people to end their own lives. Now, that wasn't always the case. At one time, it was considered a crime for people to end their own lives. And those laws were historically based on the religious belief that only God should have the power to end a life. It was considered a blasphemous rejection of God's gift of life if people ended their own lives. So, people who attempted suicide and were unsuccessful would be jailed. And if they were successful, then the surviving family members could be punished. That typically took the form of local prosecutors or local enforcement going in and seizing the assets of the survivors, leaving them impoverished. Now, we all consider that a very draconian type of law. And we now consider ourselves a more enlightened society, and suicide has been decriminalized. But aiding a suicide is still considered a crime and can be prosecuted in most states. So it's worth asking, what is the intent of laws that criminalize aiding a suicide? Is the intent to prevent a despondent person from carrying out an act of desperation? Or are these laws a holdover from the religious belief that only God should have the power to end a life? Well, I'm going to look at a few real-life cases to see how this plays out. First case is the David Fitting case. This occurred in 2010 in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, the exact same place where my parents lived. David Fitting was 26 years old, and he was arrested and charged with aiding a suicide because he handed a loaded gun to a friend who was depressed and said his life had no meaning anymore. This friend shot himself, and he died. David Fitting had a criminal record. This was his 4th arrest. He had prior convictions for theft, DUI, drug possession, that kind of thing. And his bail was set at $10,000. The outcome of this case, the prosecutor dismissed the felony aiding suicide charge, and David Fitting pleaded guilty to misdemeanor reckless endangerment. His sentence was 23 months probation. The second case is the Bill Benting case. This occurred in 2012 in Palm Springs, California. In 2012, Bill Benting was 87 years old. He was a retired entomologist. He had no criminal record. He was married to Linda, 77 years old, who was dying from end-stage emphysema. Now, emphysema is not a pleasant thing to have at any stage, but end-stage emphysema is a slow suffocation. She was totally oxygen dependent. She had suffered, she was in home hospice care. She had suffered a long time, and one day she told Bill she could not endure it anymore. She asked him to leave the room, and she removed her oxygen. And she died. Bill called the hospice and told them what happened. For some reason, they called the coroner, who called the police, and the police came to his home and arrested Bill on suspicion of murder. He was taken to jail, and his bail was set at $1 million. He was transferred from one jail to another in leg irons. His jailers ignored his pleas for help with a chronic medical condition. They made him wait over 24 hours until they took him to a hospital to be catheterized, which is the only way he can empty his bladder. He spent 3 days in jail until the Riverside County District Attorney looked at the case, determined there was no evidence to support a murder charge, nor was there any evidence to support an aiding suicide charge. He rightly declined to prosecute, and Bill was released. The third case is me. You already know some of the details. I had no criminal record. My bail was set at $100,000. My prosecution lasted a full year until a judge threw out the charge, saying there was no evidence that my father was intending to end his life, nor that I had committed a crime. Does anyone see a pattern here? The two cases that involved dying people received much harsher treatment than the case that involved a healthy young man who had a treatable mental health issue and the possibility of a full and long life ahead of him. Either the criminal justice system didn't value the life of this young man very much, or it is focused on enacting harsh punishment in end-of-life cases. These cases were not successfully prosecuted, but they succeeded magnificently in punishing the dying and their caregivers. My father survived the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, only to have the suffering at the end of his life compounded from his undertreated pain, from the anguish over my arrest, and also from having unwanted medical treatment forced upon him, because he had the audacity to take more than the meager amount of morphine that was prescribed. I'm going to tell you some of what my father's last days were like. He was frantic and distraught in the ER over my arrest. He pulled out his IV, pulled off the heart monitor, and tried to leave. The ER staff restrained his hands. He was admitted to the hospital, and a nursing assistant was assigned to sit and observe him at all times for his safety. He had multiple needle sticks for IVs and blood draws. He very quickly developed a high fever, which did not respond to Tylenol. So the hospital staff had to place ice packs around his neck, under his arms, and in his groin to cool his body down. He had a urinary catheter placed several times, and each time less urine was obtained as his kidneys failed. Because his kidneys failed, he developed a dangerously high potassium level. He wasn't on dialysis, so the next best option to treat this was to give him a medicine called Kayexalate, which lowers the potassium level in the body by causing massive diarrhea. He had this liquid medicine placed in his rectum, and it worked as intended. The profuse diarrhea led to the loss of the top layer of his skin over his entire genital area, his entire buttocks, and up to his lower back. His skin was open and raw and red. He no longer spoke, but he moaned. His failing heart and kidneys could no longer handle the IV fluid he was being given, and he developed such massive edema in both arms that they became unrecognizable. And finally, on the day he died, he received morphine to ease his discomfort. My father did everything he was supposed to do to ensure that his end-of-life wishes would be respected. What happened to him at the end of his life was reactionary, punitive, and cruel. The third element of this ordeal is criminal justice in the United States. Here are some sobering statistics. You may know this already. The United States has 5% of the world's population, and 25% of the world's prison population resides in the United States. Roughly 1 in every 107 American adults are behind bars. No country imprisons more people than the United States. So it makes perfect sense that once an arrest has been made, the goal is conviction. Within an hour of my father's death, we, his grieving family, were made to leave the room because the coroner had arrived to photograph my father's body. It was clearly being treated as a crime scene. The case against me was based on untrue evidence from the hospice and the police. Contrary to their claims, I did not say that I gave my father his morphine so he could end his life. And if the prosecutor had bothered reading the evidence they had in their possession from the beginning, they would have seen numerous contradictions between what their witnesses said and what was documented in the records. For example, hospice witnesses testified under oath that my father had never been on a narcotic medication before. That was just not true. He had a prescription from his primary doctor for tramadol, which is a narcotic, and he had received morphine from this same hospice on that prior enrollment. In court, my attorney pointed out that my father had actually been prescribed a much larger dose of morphine prior to my ever making a phone call to the hospice. And the prosecutor told the judge he was not aware of that information, and that if true, it was completely inconsistent with the testimony of his witnesses. Well, yes, it was. It discredited what those witnesses said. It was right there in the hospice record, and they never bothered to read it. My case was dismissed. The judge threw out the charge and wrote a scathing 46-page ruling. I have to mention here, in the United States, about 95% of criminal cases are settled through plea bargains. Tremendous pressure was placed on me to waive my preliminary hearing and work out a plea deal. That's a whole lot easier for a prosecutor, and they still get to count a plea bargain as a conviction. And keep in mind that prosecutors are elected officials who like to tell the voters that they are tough on crime and they have a high conviction rate. Most people who are charged with crimes don't have the resources to fight that pressure to plead. I know that I was very, very lucky to have my own excellent criminal defense counsel who fought this unjust charge. The fourth element of this, politics. But when is this case prosecuted? The police, the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, and the Schuylkill County coroner, David Moylan. Coroner Moylan made the determination that my father died of a morphine overdose, and he ruled that the manner of death was a homicide. A homicide! Now, I knew that my father died of pneumonia. I later had independent physician experts, including a forensic toxicologist, look at my father's records for an objective evaluation. They all decidedly concluded he did not die of a morphine overdose. I'll quote the toxicologist. This was not a lethal level of morphine by any means. Well, a few weeks after releasing my father's death certificate, Coroner Moylan publicly announced he was running for United States Congress on a Sanctity of Life platform. The coroner is an openly devout Catholic. He was asked in an interview what made him decide to run for Congress, and this was his answer. It just boiled down to one primary issue, and it's one I feel strongly about: the sanctity of human life. It's so important to defend human life from conception to natural death. The coroner has said publicly, I am a pro-life coroner. Another interesting oxymoron there. But he's also said this: it's very important that every decision you make as coroner to determine the cause and manner of death, how does it affect the sanctity of life? I've been doing that for the last year and a half. Ooh. Coroner Moylan won the Republican primary for that seat in Congress. It was the 17th Congressional District. Covers Schuylkill County, Luzerne, part of Lackawanna, part of Northampton. I'm very happy to say that he lost in the general election in November. Thank goodness. But that's not a reason to feel complacent. I think we all know that if that district had been drawn a little bit differently, or if he had some more campaign cash, it could have been a very different outcome. And lest you think this coroner was some unsophisticated rural county rube, I will tell you that he is a graduate of MIT and Georgetown University School of Medicine. He is a physician with a practice in radiation oncology. His position as coroner gives him the power to influence what happens to an accused person's livelihood, liberty, and even life. And he was attempting to increase his power and sphere of influence by running for Congress. Does that scare you? It should. I am well aware of what the implications were for me if a judge or a jury had believed what this coroner said. And here's one more ironic twist in this whole thing. Apparently even the prosecutor had a problem with the coroner, because he made a point of writing this in a brief to the judge. The Commonwealth has never argued that the defendant was responsible for Mr. Yorshaw's death on February 11, 2013. Now, when you consider that the Attorney General and the coroner were on the same side of this prosecution, that is a very big gulf of opinion to reconcile. Quite frankly, I don't think they ever expected it to see its way into a courtroom. They expected me to plead. So just to recap those four things: failure of hospice, a vague criminal statute, criminal justice in the United States, and politics all came together to create this horrific ordeal for my father and me. What do you think? Could this happen again? Well, here's what the Attorney General of Pennsylvania had to say after the judge dismissed my case. If the citizens of the Commonwealth disagree with an existing statute, it is incumbent upon the people to work with the General Assembly to amend the law. Until such amendment occurs, it is the legal responsibility of prosecutors to enforce the law as it currently exists. Now you know why I am telling you my story. 18 years ago, Oregon became the first state in the country to pass a death with dignity law, which allows a terminally ill, mentally competent person to obtain a prescription to bring about a peaceful death if that person feels like his or her suffering becomes intolerable. It's rarely used. The number of people who have died in Oregon under this law since it was passed is 0.2% of all deaths. But guess what happened? Within a year of the passage of this law, end-of-life care in Oregon improved in dramatic and measurable ways. Oregon is at the top of all states to have appropriate utilization of hospice, the use of medical morphine to treat pain, for the honoring of advance directives, and more people in Oregon die in their own homes than in any other state in the country. Wow! Talk about a silver lining to a law. Even the bioethicist Arthur Kaplan has said that the Oregon law has benefited many more people than have ever had to use it. Now, I'm sure you know that there is strong opposition to aid in dying laws. The most vocal and well-funded opponent is the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. But pretty much all religious conservatives oppose it. It's also opposed by some physician groups. The AMA is the most prominent one. And I just want to mention here, I erroneously thought that the AMA represented a fair number of physicians in the United States. But I looked up the statistics, and the most recent ones I could find were from 2011 from the National Institute of Health. 15% of American physicians belong to the AMA. They are hardly representative of the physicians in the United States. Another very recent happening is the California Medical Association, which did oppose aid in dying, has just changed their position from opposition to neutral. So that's a big step. Other opponents are some disability rights groups and some hospices. I have witnessed in the last year several legislative hearings where testimony has been given on proposed aid in dying bills. And I have to say that the most disturbing, and I would even say alarming testimony that I've heard are from people with deeply held religious beliefs. When they say, and I've heard it a number of times, that there is beauty and grace in suffering, and that suffering will lead to the redemption of your soul. Now, I have no problem if people feel that personally and they want to endure suffering for their own self-redemption. But I have a big problem if people are trying to codify that into social policy, particularly when it's going to affect people who don't share those beliefs, who don't happen to agree that suffering is good. So I just want to have 3 points that you remember from tonight. First point is that good hospice care is essential, and not all hospices provide good care. So what will you do if you find yourself or a loved one in need of hospice care? The best thing you can do right now is to interview several hospices before you ever make a choice. Now, I am working with an organization called Compassion and Choices. They are an end-of-life advocacy group. And they offer a service called an end-of-life consultation service. I'll have the number up here in a moment, and we have literature in the back. It's free and confidential. When you call the service, they will not recommend a specific hospice. But what they can do is advise you on what questions you should be asking when you interview prospective hospices. It's a good service, and I highly recommend it. Second point, and I think we all agree on this kind of ordeal, tragedy could happen again. Which leads me to the third point. The laws across the nation need to be changed. We need death with dignity or aid in dying in all states. Now I'm just going to give you a quick sketch of what death with dignity laws entail. A person has to be terminally ill, as determined by 2 independent physicians, mentally competent. So this excludes people with Alzheimer's or dementia. That is written into these laws as a safeguard, so that, you know, they talk about the slippery slope to euthanasia. Well, that can't happen with this kind of law. It has to be a self-request by the patient. Patient must be able to self-administer, and the person must be at least 18 years old. In the 18 years that this law has been in effect in Oregon, there has not been a single case of abuse, misuse, or coercion in the carrying out of this law. As for my father, he died a terrible death, needlessly and tragically. And that will always haunt me. I am speaking out to somehow make this right for him, my dad. I am speaking out so that no other person will ever have to experience the trauma that came to be known as the Barbara Mancini case. So I'm just going to close with the words of a very brave and selfless young woman whom the world came to know during her terminal illness with brain cancer, Brittany Menard. I had sent a message to her, never expecting to get a response. But I did. And she sent this message back to me on November 1st, 2014, the day she died. Here's what she said. It has comforted me to see your work and the power of your story. Stories like yours and mine put human faces on a controversial topic that many politicians are happy to sweep under the rug. I hope you continue to powerfully speak out on behalf of the terminally ill and our right to access the choice of dignity in death. I do intend to continue to speak out so that all people can have the best end-of-life care possible, to prevent the misuse of criminal statutes against the dying and their caregivers, and to advocate for choice at the end of life. I will be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
I just want to say one thing. The coroner's got Kathleen Kane, so we got one to say.
Yes, I have no public comment to make about Kathleen King. I'm going to let you guess what my feelings about her might be.
I have done some research on this topic. I want to make sure that people are aware of the states. It's not just Oregon, but it's also Washington, right, and Vermont has I heard court cases in Montana and in New Mexico.
That's correct. Oregon and Washington have medical aid in dying through ballot initiatives. There are states where they can put a question on the ballot and people vote on it. Montana and New Mexico have them through court cases, and Vermont is the only state that passed it through the legislature. But yes, there are 5 states in which it is legal.
Gee, I don't know much about differences between the laws. Is there much difference between the
They're pretty much based on the Oregon model. And now, interestingly, in Montana, every legislative session, there are some conservative legislators who try to overturn that. They've been trying to pass a bill that has been kind of labeled the Physician Imprisonment Act, whereby physicians who actually comply with or go through the legal process of that court order, they want to make it illegal through the legislature and then imprison the physicians and fine them $50,000. That legislation has been defeated every time it's been brought up. But because these legislators are opposing that court order, they have not codified into law the elements of the Oregon law. So the physicians who actually do provide aid in dying are following the Oregon law, but it's not written into Montana's code yet.
And
It's interesting.
does a state like Vermont have a residency requirement for how long someone has to
They
live
all do
there?
so far. Now, the state of New York is considering an aid in dying bill in which they are not asking for a residency requirement. The people who wrote the bill said that it shouldn't be dependent on what your zip code is. So that's the only state that I know so far, and I don't have a comprehensive knowledge of every state's proposals, but every law that's been proposed, and there are about 22 states now in which aid in dying legislation has been introduced, they're all based on the Oregon model because that's worked so successfully. I mean, the Oregon law has been exhaustively studied in the 18 years since it's been in existence. Detailed statistics are kept, and it's worked well. So no one's trying to reinvent the wheel, so to say.
But you don't have to have lived in the state for a certain amount of time. You
Yeah,
can just
well,
move there, right?
No, to establish residency typically means you have to have either like a rental agreement or own a property, be a registered voter, have a driver's license of that state, have a gas bill or a utility bill that shows that you're residing somewhere and all that. So you do have to meet those requirements, and that's what Brittany Menard had to do. She moved from the Bay Area of California into Oregon, and she got registered to vote there. She got her driver's license switched over. They rented a home. So it's not an easy process, and many people don't have the means to do that. Most people don't. Good questions.
I think it's really important to acknowledge if your father had written an advance directive, that's a legal document,
It is.
and that should have been honored. The fact that, like, you know, if it's do not resuscitate or whatever he was requesting on his advance directives, how that was ignored, how the voice of the patients and the requests of the patients were ignored by hospice. Not one person bothered to look at his advance directives.
Oh, they had copies of it.
I'm sure they did. I'm
yeah.
sure, yeah.
It
Like,
was documented in every entry that he had.
Yeah.
Living will, advance directives, do not resuscitate, and power of attorney.
Absolutely, and then
This-
the hospitals, yeah.
This point comes up every time I speak because people are absolutely shocked to think that, oh, they had the necessary conversations, they went to the trouble of getting these documents, possibly seen a lawyer, and they could just be invalidated that easily. Well, guess what? It happens a lot.
Yeah, I'm a nurse.
There are no criminal penalties. Yes, it happens a lot.
There's no consequences. Yes.
I mean, you could potentially initiate a civil action, but let's face it, civil lawsuits take years,
Oh my gosh.
and you may or may not prevail, and it costs money to do that. So there are some states, and Pennsylvania does have one, they have documents called PULSE or MOLS. That stands for Physician Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment. It's also a document that a person would have drawn up when you know you're terminally ill. So a healthy person doesn't do that. You do that in conjunction with a physician, and it's very specific about what you want and don't want. And they have a little more teeth, legal teeth to them. They still could be invalidated too. So unwanted medical treatment is a huge issue at the end of life. And as I said, people are absolutely shocked to hear that this can be just overruled. It's not right. I totally agree with that.
And I thought the whole purpose of having that advance directive was to put these things
Yes,
like this
that
in
is the
place.
purpose of it.
And you and your family and your father's wishes were completely ignored. I think that's,
They were clear and explicit. Yes.
I'd like to understand how this gets out of the control of the patient and the family. This was in your father's home,
Yes.
and is a contract to accept hospice care irrevocable? If
No,
hospice
no
doesn't-
contract
If
like that.
hospice doesn't follow a directive, can hospice be dismissed?
Oh, absolutely. You can terminate them at any time. You can fire them.
So this came upon, this came suddenly, it wasn't a pattern of, I mean,
Well-
you said something that puzzles me. You said that he had been prescribed morphine for a couple of weeks, and it was withheld
Yeah. Well,
by a hospice nurse. Was that without the family's knowledge? Is that what happened?
that was without our knowledge. And the nurse that was in the house that day who called 911 was the same nurse who withheld the morphine. None of us knew that until I obtained my father's records in discovery. So discovery is where someone who's charged with a crime can obtain the evidence. Couldn't get that until after my preliminary hearing. You just can't get it. So we had no idea how bad things were until I saw comfortable despite pain. They had even documented that my father had relief of his symptoms 75% of the time or greater. That's just an out and out lie. But think about it. Who's going to know that they're not doing the right thing? Dead people don't complain. And if a family's witnessing a bad hospice experience, many times these families are just too traumatized to pursue it when it's all done. And you have to consider, if you have a dying family member or loved one, you're pretty much in crisis mode as it is. One of my biggest regrets, I will always regret, was just assuming that when we contracted with this hospice that they would do what they were supposed to do. You can never assume that. I have a handout back there with some information about my case, and on the back of that, I have listed some excerpts from the federal law regarding hospice care. Oh, I wish I had known that beforehand, because I would have fired their asses. I really would have. But again, you know, I beat myself up for a long time about that. Well, while I was under prosecution, I had a whole lot of time on my hands because I was no longer working. I had to take unpaid leave. So I spent my time doing a lot of research about the Oregon law, about the hospice laws, what they're supposed to do, end-of-life issues. And what I found out, my husband's sitting right over there. How many days did we cry over this? It was, and one of the most painful things that someone can do is read the medical records of a loved one. And I'll never forget when we found out that he had morphine prescribed from the beginning. I couldn't believe it. In one way that was good for me because it threw out the prosecutor's case as far as she planned this by calling for morphine for her father, who was in severe pain. So, you know, you can see once that 911 call was made, it started this process that just took on a life of its own. And it doesn't stop. Maybe there could have been some reasonable people along the way, but you will never know what the preconceived notions or values are of any of these people who come into your home or who are first responders or anything. You don't know where they're coming from on this. I strongly suspect, but I cannot ever prove, that these people may have had very strong religious objections to anything but what was happening their way. So I don't know that, but certainly the coroner did not hide his religious feelings at all.
Do you think it was possible that because of your nursing background, that they had a bias against you?
Yes, I do.
Right from the beginning? I mean,
Yes.
before the prosecutor or the police or anybody else were involved with this?
Well, here's a little more background on this. When I made the phone call to the hospice, asking them to prescribe morphine, because he'd been on it before, the person I spoke to, who happened to be that person's testimony I had up on the screen, she gave me a hard time, and she told me that she didn't think it was appropriate for my father to be on morphine. She argued with me about it, and she felt it was more appropriate for him to be on another narcotic called Percocet. Now, Percocet's a narcotic. Morphine is more appropriate for people who are short of breath at the end of life. So it not only relieves pain, it also relieves shortness of breath. So I disagreed with her. And she told me, well, she'll have to speak to the doctor about it. I never knew it was already ordered. It was already a valid order there. And my father received the morphine a day and a half later. Now, you will see in those hospice excerpts that I put on my sheet that drugs and biologicals are, by law, to be available 24/7, not 36 hours later. And this particular hospice supervisor interceded and requested that the morphine dose be lowered. So his original dosage was 5 to 10 milligrams. He could have it every 2 to 4 hours. He could increase it twice the base dose. She had it decreased to 2.5 milligrams every 4 hours. So it ended up being a fraction of the original dose. So was my being a nurse and calling about this a part of it? I think absolutely it was. I think I made her angry, and that was the result. Yeah. I also think they didn't like my dad very much, because another thing that we cried over when we read his records, one social worker in particular clearly had an issue with my dad. She said he had a negative attitude, that he was stubborn, and she arrived to find him in his usual state of grumpiness. Very unprofessional and has no place in a medical record. It's like the nightmare hospice. But who knew? I didn't know. You know, we're trying to do our best to get through this whole thing and do the best for my dad and support him, support my mother. So, wow, what a learning experience this was. Painful learning experience.
Just wondering, in the states that have enacted the DWD laws, has there been like any compelling economic argument for it, like in terms of saving Medicare and Medicaid dollars? Because I think I've read that a large portion of Medicare and Medicaid dollars are spent on like the last
That's
day or
very
the
true.
last week. But you also said that only 2% and 1% of whoever are taking advantage. So that argument may not be there, but it might be a compelling
Well,
one for
the
Republicans.
opponents always bring that issue up.
Yeah.
They say that this law is going to target vulnerable populations. Who's vulnerable? The elderly, poor, uneducated, people with disabilities, racial or ethnic minorities, groups that you think would be vulnerable populations who our society doesn't want to spend money on for medical care. Well, the 18 years of data out of Oregon show that the people who actually utilize this law are not those people. They are overwhelmingly well-educated, middle to upper class, overwhelmingly white. They are people who are insured. Many of them have private insurance, and upwards of 90% are in hospice care already. So these are not people who have been denied medical care. They've been getting medical care. So that argument about it's going to target the vulnerable and we're going to do this because it's easier and a lot cheaper than paying for, you know, end-of-life care or cancer treatment, that hasn't been borne out at all. So I would say that's a legitimate argument if it's been found out to be true, but it hasn't.
Can you say something about the way our political parties line up on this issue? You just indicated that there would be some people who would be concerned that the minorities or underprivileged people would be at a disadvantage with this law. I would think that those people would be on the liberal side of the political spectrum, and yet on the other extreme,